have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The Common Senseless podcast starts now.
Okay. Thanks, guys. And welcome to the first ever Common Senseless podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Depperschmidt. The Common Senseless podcast is common sense in a world that has none. And let me just start off by explaining why it is that I started this podcast. My wife and I would turn on the news at night, and every night it just seemed like, these headlines were getting more and more ridiculous. Finally one night it pops up and it says California lawmakers have tried to pass this bill that would make it legal to teach the pleasures of sex to kindergartners. Seriously? The pleasures of sex to kindergartners. I'm not a genius by any means, but I do have some common sense, and common sense was telling me, hey, that's not okay. Why in the world would we rob these children of their innocence? There was no reason for it. It's absolutely absurd. And frankly, I was disappointed, and this is why. A recent ABC poll suggested that 86% of Americans call themselves Christians. And if that's the case, where are they? Why aren't we outraged about things like this? Have we become so relaxed in our faith that we would allow kindergarten-age children to be robbed of their innocence? I think that's flat out wrong. And talking to my wife that night, I said this exact thing. Honey, where are the Christians? And she said, well, what are you doing about it? And it really made me stop and think, and absolutely nothing came to mind. I'm just as bad. I watch it on TV, and I do absolutely nothing. So that is why I decided to start the Common Senseless podcast. It's just me trying to do something to expose Satan for what he is. And I have a theory about Satan, and it all starts with Adam and Eve in Genesis. I think it only takes you to maybe the second page before we are introduced to Satan for the first time. And he's a serpent, and he's talking to Eve, and he says, hey, Eve, I know there's only one fruit in this entire garden that you're not allowed to touch. And you know why? Because if you eat that fruit, God knows that it'll make you as smart as he is. And what we see there is Satan putting up a smoke screen, or what I call static noise. A smoke screen is something that distracts you from what's actually going on. In World War I, when we were flying planes really for the first time in war, we would put smoke screens up, and it would make it hard for the planes to be able to see where they were flying. It would distract them from their objective. And that's what Satan still does today, is he puts up that smoke screen, and it distracts you from what you're really thinking about. And same goes for static noise. I know most of you have seen an older TV that has static noise. Some of you might be too young to remember that, but static noise is my favorite illustration with this, because what is static noise? Black and white pixels on a television, and when you're up close you can see the black and white fuzz, but when you step away from your TV you see that it's just gray. And the Bible clearly says, there's black and there's white, there's wrong and there's right. And what this podcast is about is helping you decipher through those gray areas and figure out what is wrong and what is right, and just putting a name to it. So let's fast forward back to present day in the topic of pleasures of sex being taught to our kindergarten age children, and let's figure out how we even ended up thinking that would be okay. I think you have to look at how Satan has attacked the family unit, and starting with parents. And he did this in many, many ways, but for time's sake, I'm only going to talk about this one topic, and that is, he told parents, it's too awkward to talk to your children about sex. It's hard, it's weird, and he put up that smoke screen. And so what did we do? We dumped that responsibility off on the public schools. And really, that's where a lot of this started, because I can remember even only 15 years ago how outraged people were that safe sex was being taught in public schools as opposed to abstinence. And I remember when they were handing out condoms in schools, and people were irate. But we've gone from even only 15 years ago till now, where not only are we not irate that we teach safe sex in schools, but we're teaching them in junior high and even grade schools across the country. Why can't it be okay now? The smoke screens, they're all set in place. I mean, it's better that they learn about safe sex than for them to get pregnant at 13. So what have we done? We've taken away the natural consequences of sex. And by doing that, we're telling our kids, hey, as Christians, we're telling our kids, don't have sex until you're married. But we're at the same time, we're giving them mixed signals, because we're saying, don't get married till you're 30. Hey, don't get married until you've lived life. What does that even mean? I mean, some of the greatest things that are told to us in the Bible are that, a godly woman is like a crown of jewels upon your head, or, a child is a gift from the Lord. And so we're taking away our children's, basically, the blessings from God. We're wanting them to postpone those and live in a lifestyle of sin, basically. Because if you're wanting them to go to college and get a job and be on their own for a while and be independent, what you're doing is you're setting them up to fail. Because there's so much pressure put on that young person these days that there's really no way. It's everywhere they are. You can't go out. You can't watch TV. You can't listen to your music. You can't do anything without being told, the way to live today is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, that really is what you're telling them to do. You're telling them to go and live a sinful lifestyle for a while, and what they'll probably end up with is a bunch of baggage that they carry into their next relationship. And that, eventually they are going to get married. And what I find interesting is that over 50% of marriages today end in divorce. When Grandma and Grandpa were in school, they were getting married right out of high school, and sometimes even in high school, or would quit high school and get married. And Grandma and Grandpa are still married. Mom and Dad, not so much. It's interesting. The Grandma and Grandpa are the ones who said, go live life and have fun before you get married. We got married young and we regret it and blah, 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 blah. But they're still married because they went through hard times and they made it through and they made it work. And because getting married, I will say you probably will have more hard times because you're married to that person longer. You realize that they're not perfect earlier on. And so, it is harder to get married younger, but if you get married younger, you go through those things together. You discover who you are together, and you grow towards God together. And that's something that's not happening now when you wait till you're 30, because when you wait till you're 30, you already know who you are. Remember, you're taught your kids to be independent, and then you threw them in a house with somebody else who also was taught to be independent. And you're going to have some clashes there. I don't know how you wouldn't. The couple that got married, in their 20s and right out of high school, they're way ahead of the learning curve. Yeah, it is harder to be married from 20 to 30 than it is to be single from 20 to 30. But think about what you're asking these kids. You're asking them not to have sex, but you're also telling them to wait until they're 30. And clearly, in a culture that puts so much emphasis on sex, that's not going to happen. So that's what I'm trying to say, and it just starts with sex, and because sex is sexy. Sex is sexy. You can market sex really easy to a young kid, and it's easy for them to get entangled in, and then they're going to start, you can take a teenager, for example. A teenager is ready to have sex the moment they're done with puberty. And honestly, that's when in most cultures before today, there wasn't such thing as a teenager. Once you turned 13, usually, as soon as you went through puberty, you were allowed to have responsibilities. They would give you work, you would get a job, you were a soldier, you were whatever. And now what we're doing is we've got these kids that have all the tools to be an adult at the age of 13, and we're telling them, be a kid, and really until you're 30. And what do we expect? We're setting these kids up to fail. I think that one of the greatest smoke screens that Satan's put up in recent years is that Christians, a lot of times I'll be talking to a Christian, and I'll say, oh, I'm glad they're going to get married because it has to be hard for them to wait for, to have sex before they get married. And a Christian a lot of times will look at you and say, yeah, but having sex is a bad reason to get married. And it makes me wonder, because in the Bible, it never says that. It actually says it's one of the major reasons to get married. And, even God in the Old Testament tells us that once a man and wife are married, it's their obligation to reproduce. And I think if you look at those things, it just doesn't add up to say that that's a bad reason to get married. Because quite frankly, if you were to wait, every year that you wait, your percentage to bring baggage into your future marriage does nothing but rise. Okay, so the whole point of this show is to give you a common sense solution. And what is that? Obviously, sitting down with your kid and having an open line of communication about sex and about the consequences of sex. And, is it going to be awkward? Maybe it might be, but think about this. Is it going to be more awkward for that kid to someday have to sit down and explain his sexual baggage to his future partner because you thought it was too awkward to talk to your kid about sex? Also, we can't send mixed signals to our kids. We can't encourage them to remain pure and then tell them they shouldn't get married until they're 30 years old. It's just adding all that much more pressure on them to fail. And kids know what's important to you, and you've got to make that a priority. You've got to make purity, as a Christian, you've got to make purity more important than education or going out and living that lifestyle that you never had, because all you're really doing is setting that kid up to fail. And we're out of time for today. I would like to mention our sponsors, Debt Bros Clothing. Check them out at www.debtbros.com. Also, if you have a topic that you would like to hear me talk about on the Common Senseless podcast, email me with your topics at commonsenseless@rocketmail.com. Also, be sure to like the Common Senseless Facebook page, and you can download our podcast at iTunes, or even you can go to YouTube and search Common Senseless Podcast, or also at www.podbean.com. There's lots of ways to enjoy the Common Senseless podcast. Join us next week as we cut through the static noise that surrounds Christmas.
I'm dreaming